Yes, Jean Carvers-Doué, professor of public health, and I think we should debate of what is a catastrophe. And I'm surprised that nobody tried to remember that the largest catastrophe in the last 2 years was certainly not Fukushima, but a flood in Pakistan, which, as you remember, flooded an area larger than Austria. 20 million people were displaced, and 10,000 people died. So we are speaking of nuclear energy with a fear, unfounded fears about Scotland. I could come back to that, about the consequences of what happened after Chernobyl. But we don't speak of air pollution in China. 400,000 people die of air pollution in China. Certainly coal mining is much more dangerous in 1 year than all the civil atomic industry since it exists. Because as you know, there is a WHO report on the deaths of Chernobyl. And the number of people we can count is 56. And the number of people who might die or have their life shortened after Chernobyl varies according to estimate WHO. So you can check, varies from 4,000 to 16,000 in 50 years. And the coal mining industry killed 20,000 people a year. So what do we call a catastrophe? I think tonight we have taken a very mediatic definition of what could be a catastrophe.
I appreciate the additions that you've made to our list of catastrophes. I think your point is a good one. What we're trying to do here was to deal with two subjects that are very much on the mind of people. Perhaps that's what the media also deals with, and I accept your remark and the criticism implied. Sir.
Thank you, Stuart Patrick, Council on Foreign Relations. Two questions. The first to Mr. Romano. You mentioned the fear that Iran, for instance, might be diverting some of its enriched nuclear material to a weapons program. What is the status of discussions about creating an international nuclear fuel bank, which obviously would help to deal with some of these problems? And then the question to Mr. Charney. I wonder whether or not, you mentioned some of the advantages of the fact that we've had cyberspace, the internet basically governed loosely by private corporation, the role of ICANN, et cetera. But I wonder if we're not in for a major collision course with governments, and governments often that share different values. Earlier today, Thierry de Montbrial talked about some of the growing diversity out there in the world. And when it comes to internet security or cyberspace security, there are several different risks that you've discussed. There's obviously cybercrime, which unites many governments. There's cyber espionage and cyber war, including the question of whether one should have a treaty governing what are the potential uses and what are legitimate uses, sort of along the lines of laws of war. But another big one is the question of human rights and openness of the internet. Yesterday, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton really laid into countries that go against the U.S. vision of an open, private, and largely anonymous internet. And this is something that even countries that are democracies like India are beginning to contemplate. Could you speak to that dilemma?
Sure. Go ahead.
Yes. There was a question about nuclear fuel bank. So I would like to very briefly explain what is a nuclear fuel bank and what is the progress, current status. Especially in the recent years, more countries have shown interest in nuclear power generation. And if that is the case, more nuclear fuel will be needed. And it is normal that these countries who are considering to introduce nuclear power worry about the shortage of nuclear fuel. The idea of a nuclear fuel bank is to establish a kind of bank to get prepared for a situation in which supply of nuclear fuel is disturbed by non-commercial reasons. We have received a couple of proposals to that effect. One is from Russia, and they have proposed to establish an international bank of nuclear fuel. It was adopted by the Board of Governors of the decision-making body of the IAEA, and decision was made some 2 years ago, and the low-enriched uranium are stocked under the IAEA safeguard. Now it is operational. So there exists at least one nuclear fuel bank. Another idea is to establish the IAEA nuclear fuel bank. Again, the basic decision has already been made, and now we are in the process of implementing the decision. We have invited countries to host the nuclear fuel bank, and one country applied, expressed its intention to host the nuclear fuel bank, and we are now making necessary preparations for the procurement of low-enriched uranium, conclude the agreement, and other things. We have already secured necessary funds to purchase the low-enriched uranium. We have another scheme proposed by United Kingdom to give a guarantee for the procurement of enriched uranium. So for now, we have one international fuel bank, one guarantee system, and another IAEA nuclear fuel bank system is under preparation.
Let me turn to your questions. First of all, even in your question when you talked about cybercrime, espionage, cyber warfare, and freedom of expression, it just highlights how transformative the internet is in everything that we do now. There are countries in the past, Russia in particular, has long proposed a cyber warfare treaty of sorts. Other countries have been reluctant, in part because of the inability to do any verification on that kind of treaty. Having said that, there are now discussions, too, about should there be a Geneva Convention for the internet. It's a really important point that in traditional warfare, the battlefield is nature-made, and in the internet, the battlefield is man-made. And most of the battlefield, to be successful in battle, may involve using the communication pipes of the mostly private sector, some places telecom is still nationalized, and taking out private sector assets. And the challenge for countries and for the private sector and for citizens is that the internet is a shared and integrated domain. You have individuals, companies, and governments sharing this domain, and they also share it in terms of activity. There's free speech and espionage packets and warfare packets, potentially, and these things are integrated in a way that you can't tease them apart. You know, we used to fly balloons, or you put a big red cross on top of the building saying, this is private space, and you can't bomb here because of proportional damage to civilians. And the challenges on the internet, it all looks alike. They're just IP addresses. And so while people have started to look at the laws of armed conflict and the Geneva Convention relative to cyber, it's hard to apply. With regard to freedom of expression, Microsoft, in fact, is part of the Global Network Initiative, a group of companies and non-governmental organizations committed to protecting free speech and freedom of association on the internet. The real challenge is that free speech is not a place, it's really a continuum. On one end of the continuum, you have the United States and the First Amendment, and virtually any, pre-restriction on speech is out. You have other countries, including democratic countries, that regulate a lot more speech. Germany, Canada, the UK, they have hate speech laws and neo-Nazi laws and other things that they apply. And then you have repressive regimes. And, you know, at the end of the day, these are about both cultural differences about free speech, and it's also about what form of government do you have and who got to decide. And as you can imagine, that's quite a contentious point. I can tell you that when I chaired the G8 subgroup on high-tech crime, the G8 was developing a whole set of principles around cybercrime. And what would happen is we'd agree on all these crime-fighting things, and then the other countries would say to the US delegation, we're now going to talk about restricting speech. You should go have some coffee. And what they would do is you would draft an agreement and an addendum. The agreement we all signed, the addendum everyone signed or most signed, but the US did not, because restrictions on speech would violate the Constitution. I would add one more thing. You know, I've always been amazed that, you know, very often you come to a problem with a mindset and you don't think about some other variation on the theme. So as part of GNI, and a lot of people are worried about freedom of expression and free speech on the internet and not censoring or restricting speech. But in the Arab Spring, the Egyptian government directed Vodafone to affirmatively send a message that was propaganda-like. And Vodafone, which would have lost its license if it didn't send it, did two things. They sent the message, but they were also transparent and said, the government told us to send this message, so that's why we sent it. But it's not just about restricting speech. You can compel speech, too. And that's a different problem, but a serious one.
I think this has been a very rich discussion. This is a great point to end it on. I think if we can establish a really credible fuel bank, I can think of no greater contribution to global governance than that. I want to thank our speakers for an excellent program tonight, and I want to thank you and the audience for sticking on to the bitter end.